happy that all of you can join us today. I know there was a lot of excitement about today's topic. So our topic for today is the state of Chatham, Savannah's wet romp through Prohibition. And our speaker is Dr. Lisa Denmark, who is with us from Georgia Southern University. Dr. Denmark was born and raised in Effingham County, but she has been living in Savannah since 2000. She received her master's in history from Georgia Southern University and a PhD from the University of South Carolina. She is an associate professor of history at Georgia Southern, and her original primary research focus was Savannah's post-Civil War financial collapse when the municipal government defaulted on many of its loans, which was typical of a national trend, which I think would be a really interesting topic we probably would like to hear about too at some point. Her current focus is the city's investment in canals and railroads, but of course today she's going to share with us what was going on in Savannah during Prohibition. So with that, I'm going to turn it on over to you.
Thank you very much. So when Luciana contacted me and said she'd heard I'd recently done a presentation on one of the canals, or the canal here in Savannah, and asked me if I would be interested in doing that for you guys, I said, well, I have a much more fun topic, drinking. So that's what we're going to talk about today. I will begin with sort of a personal story. A few years ago, I was sitting at a local establishment on Bay Street that is known for its ghosts, having a libation with some friends, and there were these two gentlemen sitting next to us, and they were clearly from out of town. One of them had finished their beer, the other had not, and one was ready to go, and the other said, I haven't finished my beer, and I just turned around and I said, you know you can take that with you. And there was this look of utter disbelief. He was incredulous, did not believe me, and I said, no, really, we have a to-go cup law. You can take that with you in a plastic cup. Still no belief, at which point the bartender came over, handed him a plastic cup because he'd clearly seen this many times, and said, she's right, you can take it with you. He was very happy, very friendly, thanked me, bought me a beer, left. I've since been bought several beers by just providing people with that small piece of knowledge. I'm not going to be talking about the to-go cup law today, but just a reminder that Savannah, and I tell people this, Savannah is very serious and civilized about its drinking. And so we're going to start way back for a couple of small stories. Way back in the colonial period when Georgia was founded, you may or may not know this, but one of the things that was expressly prohibited in the colony originally was rum. Oglethorpe believed that rum caused sickness. He also believed that a lot of the poor, unfortunate people he was bringing to the colony had fallen on hard times because they had abused alcohol. So rum's prohibited. Beer and wine, by the way, they're fine. They're nutritious in the 18th century. And compared to drinking the Savannah water, most definitely good at that point. So you have to realize, though, that you tell people they can't have the one thing they want, and they're going to go out and get it. And you can see up here on the slide, I've got James Oglethorpe, who was going to be in charge of helping enforce this prohibition on rum. You might recognize John Wesley. There's an interesting story that there's absolutely no proof to, but that supposedly John Wesley was helping in the rum interdiction on Cockspur Island. That's where Fort Pulaski is. Fort Pulaski was not there at the time. It was a very lonely place, and there are some who say that John Wesley's time out there, he had a lot of time to think, and this is where he came up with the basic tenets of Methodism. There's absolutely no truth to that. It's a great story. I tell my survey students that. Actually, Wesley was on Cockspur Island. That's where people came in and landed before they made their way to Savannah. But what happened is the prohibition on rum in early Georgia meant that the first black market established in Savannah was to sell rum. And Savannah, since that point, has been very good at disobeying any effort on the part of the city, the state, and the national government to keep them from getting their daily dram. In the 1850s, this guy named Edward Anderson ran for mayor. He was running on a ticket called the Law and Order ticket, and he promised to enforce the Sunday Blue laws. That means that everything is supposed to be closed on Sunday. And he promised to crack down on licensing taverns and arresting drunks. And the people swept him in on this ticket, won by a landslide, and he proceeded to do exactly what he had promised to do. The people immediately voted him out of office because he promised. He did what he promised. And it's just a reminder that Savannahans wanted a degree of enforcement, but not too much. So before we begin in earnest, two maps here, 1893 and 1917. Most of the United States, about 60% of the United States, was already under some kind of prohibition law by the time the 18th Amendment was passed by Congress in 1917. And you'll notice there that Georgia's status changed between 1893 and 1917, and that's what we're going to talk about, is that Georgia existed under prohibition laws a long time before the nation actually passed the 18th Amendment, and that means that Savannah had a long time to practice on how to get around the national prohibition. A couple of definitions: the wets, the dries, the proes, and the antes. The wets, because I will use these terms throughout the presentation, the wets are the people who drink, or the people who oppose prohibition. The dries are the people who don't drink or who support prohibition. And of course the proes are support prohibition, the antes are against it. And in the newspapers, these are the terms that they're going to use, assuming everybody knows what they're talking about. The other term up there, local option. This was one of the first efforts to try to cut down on the drinking or try to restrict drinking in various areas. So after the Civil War, mostly in the 1880s, the temperance movement, which had been one of the most popular pre-Civil War reform movements across the nation, picked up steam again in the 1880s. And they're going to focus on these local licensing laws or local option laws. And the vestiges are still with us today. When Georgia finally, a few years ago, voted to allow the sale of alcohol on Sundays, they gave each county, right, the power to then enforce that legislation or decide when it was going to go enforce. So a form of local option is still around today. You'll know Savannah did it very quickly, which should not surprise you. And the reason local option in spirit had some advantages. It was tied in with the concept of home rule, which was a very popular idea in the late 19th century. This idea that municipalities knew what was best for the people in those cities. It was tied into local control. It was tied into this concept of democracy. So cities and townships and counties would get to decide the rules. Wet versus dry, licensing requirements, and taxes on the sale of alcohol. The other thing, the other advantage it had is it kept state lawmakers from having to stake out a position on this issue of prohibition, right? They could wash their hands of it and say, you know, cities and counties are going to deal with it. The wets and the dries had different positions on local option. Initially, if you were a wet, you opposed any form of restriction, but gradually the wets decided that local option was basically the lesser of the evils. Local option or prohibition, local option seemed like the better alternative. Those who advocated some form of temperance, some form of restriction, also supported local option. Prohibition advocates, and of course prohibition, they want to eliminate all alcohol, the sale, the distribution, the manufacturing, the consumption, the whole 9 yards. They believed that local option was merely a first step in this process of establishing much further restrictions at the local, at the state, and at the national level. And so while the dries are going to push local option, they see this as a means to an end. Right? The wets see local option as this is as far as we're going to go on the issue of prohibition. In 1899, this was going to be the first significant effort by the dries to get a general prohibition law passed by the General Assembly. It's called the Willingham Bill. Savannah's representatives were in the forefront of the opposition to this statewide prohibition. Their opposition centered on things like personal liberty and a concern for people's respect for the law. There was this argument that if you pass a law that people really don't think is, well, good, they're going to disobey it. And part of it's this notion of a victimless crime. Walter P. LaRoche, who was one of our representatives, stated in one of the debates, and I'm quoting here, "I think that the author of this bill is actuated by the highest motives for the public good, but I prefer to do my own eating and drinking for myself." And he then goes on to argue about personal liberty. One opponent took the rhetoric to extremes, claiming that forcing prohibition on wet counties would be, quote, "an act of despotism. A king could do no worse." Others warned that it would simply drive the traffic underground and encourage lawbreaking. In the end, the Willingham bill died in the Senate, but it would not be the last attempt by the Dries to get statewide prohibition enacted. The next time came in 1906 with the gubernatorial election, and it was a heated election. I know it should surprise no one. The politics in Georgia can be quite rancorous, and the 1906 gubernatorial election was just plain nasty. And it's going to pit Hoke Smith versus Clark Howell. Hoke Smith ran as a progressive reformer. His platform included more money for education and a disfranchisement bill to just disfranchise African Americans to permit them from voting again. And in 1906, he argued that was a reform. He was also a proponent of local option. There was nothing in this election, not one word spoken about prohibition. Did not come up. But after his election, Smith was asked, and Smith won the election, after the election he was asked, if the legislature passed a prohibition bill, hypothetically, would you sign it? And he said yes. And at that point, the Dries got really excited and they started mobilizing their forces. And ultimately, then, what we see happening is that the Dries get a prohibition bill passed in the legislature. Hoke Smith said, if the legislature passes it, I will sign it. And he did. Much of the historical focus on the link between, in the South especially, is on the link between racism and prohibition. In 1906, in the midst of this gubernatorial campaign in Atlanta, newspapers printed some sensationalist and very false reports of African American men raping white women. White mobs formed and attacked African Americans in the streets. They pulled them out of their shops. They attacked and looted successful black businesses. And by the time the governor decided to act and bring in the militia, several African Americans had been killed or wounded. The timing of prohibition in Georgia and the South as a whole has often been associated with the race question. One outside observer noted that prohibition in Georgia was a result of, quote, the deliberate determination of the stronger race to forgo its own personal liberty for the protection of the weaker race, from the crimes that are caused by drunkenness, and of both races from the demoralization that follows upon racial crime. To be quite honest, I have struggled with this consensus. Undoubtedly, race played a role. No doubt, rural prohibitionists used the race card like a bludgeon as they demanded statewide prohibition laws. However, the cities like Atlanta, Savannah, and Augusta, ground zero for potential future race problems, strenuously opposed any efforts to move beyond local option. If it were simply a matter of race, the urban counties would have fallen in lockstep with this issue, just as they had with African American disfranchisement, which they voted for. Instead, all of these urban counties opposed the Dries on this issue. In Savannah, the opponents included the City Council, the Mayor, the Chamber of Commerce, the Board of Trade, bankers, the Clearing Association, local judges, attorneys, and organized labor. How often is it that all those people are on the same page? Well, when it comes to drinking, they were. Appropriately on July 4th, 1907, the Savannah Morning News reported, Savannah goes squarely on record as being violently opposed to the passage of any general prohibition bill. The mayor of Savannah at the time, George Tiedemann, was quite vocal in his opposition. His officers had a hard enough time enforcing the Sunday closing laws. There was no way Savannah could afford enough police officers to enforce prohibition, nor did he want to have to do that. He said, "The vast majority of our people are heartily and conscientiously opposed to such legislation and will earnestly resent its being forced upon them. The result will be that the enforcement in this community of this law, lacking sentiment, will be impracticable, drinking will not decrease, and liquor will be sold, but without license or regulation." There was another concern as well. Savannah stood to lose about $50,000 in tax revenue from licensing. $50,000 in 1907, that's a lot of money. One grocer agreed with this. He said he wasn't worried about the Prohibition law. He'd get to sell alcohol without paying a licensing tax. Anti-prohibitionists, or the antis, were certain that Georgia had become insane over this issue. One local Savannian referred to her country legislators as driveling idiots. Despite the concerted opposition from urban areas, the rural counties, which dominated the Assembly, passed the Prohibition bill by large margins. When Governor Smith signed the bill into law, he proclaimed it to be the happiest day of his life. Anyone paying attention might have smiled at the irony of Smith's statement, for the bill he was signing had the potential to cost him $60,000 because he was part owner of one of the hotels in Atlanta, which did a great business at selling alcohol. That is, if the Prohibition bill did what the Prohibitionists thought it would do. When reality struck, some of the antis advocated extreme action, including having Chatham County secede from Georgia so that Savannah could create its own liquor laws. According to one unnamed gentleman, Savannah could easily form a state by combining several of the coastal counties into the state of Chatham. In his annual report, Mayor Tiedemann once again noted the opposition to the law, noted his resentment of the state nullifying the democratic process, and stated his opinion that the law could not be enforced. So the draws locked onto Savannah as a potential problem. Wholesale dealers in Savannah planned to move to Jacksonville or Chattanooga, where they could then ship liquor into Georgia, because that wasn't illegal. Some began stocking up and laying in a supply to survive the coming drought. Others were already looking for ways to get around the law. In one interpretation of the statute, liquor could not be seized in places where it was stored unless they could prove it was stored for the purpose of sale. Private social clubs, which were both licensed and taxed by the state, considered this quite the loophole, and they developed what was known as the locker system. Patrons became members and were given their own pigeonholes for their own liquor. Nothing was being sold. It was all nice and legal. As a takeoff of this system, so-called locker clubs sprouted virtually overnight. By the time Prohibition went into effect in Savannah in 1908, it was estimated there are 147 locker clubs in Savannah. In this interesting mutation, the way it worked is that these clubs had a private membership. And the members who purchased liquor would sign a ticket. And at the end of the month, the tickets were added up, and that would be their dues. So they weren't actually buying alcohol, they were paying their membership each month. Accepting their claim to be private clubs, Savannah City Council, members of some of these clubs, sanctioned them by regulating them and taxing them. The only restrictions involved were keeping good order, obeying the Sunday closing laws, and paying the proper tax. It even formed a club license committee to receive the applications. Saloon houses quickly adapted. As one cynic later stated, the 1907 law would not hold water, but it would hold beer. The final part of the Prohibition bill had failed to specify the percentage of alcohol. Instead, it outlawed, in rather vague terms, alcohol sufficient to cause intoxication when drunk to excess. Near-beer saloons flourished, selling beer substitutes or Unos. This is Anheuser-Busch's version called Bevo or Bevo. Many claim that these were practically soft drinks, and I suppose if you've ever had an O'Doul's, you might agree with that. In describing near beer, one observer stated, "It looks like real beer. It foams like real beer. It even smells like real beer. But the old familiar taste is lacking." Another taster was more critical and to the point. "It may look and smell like beer, but it ain't got no conversation." For the most part, saloons sold real beer in bottles labeled near beer. Both the city and the state quickly legitimized these legal establishments by taxing them. Savannah's near bill tax was expected to bring in about $50,000. Coincidentally, the same amount they were projected to lose from Prohibition. In addition to the locker clubs, Savannah had approximately 700 blind tigers, probably an exaggerated estimate, in the form of near beer saloons, corner groceries, fruit stands, and the like. Now, a blind tiger is basically an establishment that is going to sell you illegal beer by selling you a ticket to see a blind tiger, and when you walk through the door, you get your daily libation. When enough Prohibition pressure built, the police in Savannah would launch high-profile blind tiger raids. These usually occurred in a timely fashion right before the General Assembly met to say, you know, we're actually doing our job. Generally, however, most of these raids were less sensational and achieved the city's real goals of regulating rather than prohibiting and collecting revenue rather than hindering sales. The method went something like this. On a set day, a plainclothes detective would target about 100 blind tigers. Yes, everyone knew where they were and who they were. They would show up and tell the proprietor, "See the chief at 3. The proprietors dutifully went to see the chief at 3 and posted a $100 bond. When the case was called and they did not appear, they forfeited the bond, which then went in city coffers. One headline in Atlanta quipped, "This was how Savannah petted its tigers." The Prohibition humbug nearly endangered Savannah's chances for hosting the famous Vanderbilt Cup races, which we were desperately trying to steal from New York. In April of 1908, W.J. Day Johnlin, who was the Secretary of the Chamber of Commerce, went to New York to promote Savannah as a location. And he ran into some difficulty because they seemed to think sport would have a poor chance of thriving in a temperance town like Savannah. Donlin, just by chance, had on hand some of Savannah's Prohibition beer. He let some of the drivers taste the beer. Indeed, good feeling spread, and all voted Prohibition beer as good as the real article. When the sporting world arrived, Savannah demonstrated that Prohibition or no, the city knew how to entertain. One critic caustically remarked, "Savannah was so open you could drive a dray through it." And they did not bother to hide it. During the races, Savannahans wore buttons saying, I live here, ask me. An Atlantean asked one of these, "Where can I get a drink?" At which point the native pointed to a church. Outraged, the Atlantean said, "For heaven's sake, man, you can't get a drink there, can you?" To which the native replied, "No, but you can get one anywhere else." At the races, the bars, in a nod to their duty to entertain, were moved from the second and third floors to the ground floors for easy access. It was estimated that 10,000 bottles of Pabst, Schlitz, and Budweiser were sold in 2 days. Lest you think that this was done without state approval, the governor, Hoke Smith, was on hand to watch the races. He even loaned the militia to Savannah for crowd control to make sure people weren't running across the racetrack and getting killed. But apparently, none of the law enforcement agents ever saw any Prohibition beer sold. A different kind of guest visited the city in 1909, down here in the far corner, one of the pictures. Savannah graciously opened its doors to President William Howard Taft, and in his honor, they provided a very lavish banquet. During Taft's War I tour of Georgia, he was accompanied by Georgia's governor. Now, Taft was a stickler for the law, so he's going to, tactfully refuse to drink Chatham artillery punch. Probably also smart on his account. The many revelers who greeted Taft and who watched him speed down the race course were less disciplined, and they printed what all these banquets and everything were having, the menus. So in addition to caviar and terrapin, the guests were treated to martini cocktails, sparkling champagne, Chatham artillery punch, Oglethorpe punch, and apricot brandy. All right in the open. Now, there are a lot of people who are rather upset about Savannah's, lack of enforcement. Some would say that Savannah was in a state of anarchy for refusing to obey the state laws. And there were various efforts by prohibitionist groups to try to tackle the Savannah problem. A group calling itself the Silent Legion decided that it was going to try a new tactic. It was going to try to close all 400 Savannah establishments illegally selling alcohol by using a public nuisance injunction. They managed to get 7 before deciding it was not going to work. In 1914, the National Anti-Saloon League decided to target Savannah. Individuals, representatives of the Anti-Saloon League, visited near-beer saloons, and while there purchased whiskey in public, and they gathered all this evidence, and they presented it to 2 different grand juries in Savannah. They even produced the liquor they had purchased, and the grand juries refused to take any action. Having been stymied by Savannah's willful wets, by 1915, Georgia's proies had become quite fed up. They forced a special session of the Georgia General Assembly. In a sense, one might say they hijacked the Assembly. One fervid, dry legislature proposed to, quote, make the smell of liquor illegal in Georgia. They were successful. The final bill prohibited the manufacture or sale of any drink containing more than 1/2 of 1% of alcohol, thus ending near beer. Locker clubs, near beer saloons, breweries previously tolerated were now supposed to evaporate. At the time, no one doubted that the state of Chatham would remain wet. You see, we'd covered ourselves. We'd elected a mayor who was an out-and-out wet. His name was Richard Devant. And just to make sure he was going to remain in power, we changed our charter so that mayors are elected to 4-year terms. So we're fine. However, by the time the law went in force in 1916, Mayor Devant was no longer with us. He had journeyed to Millen in late 1915 to visit his beloved hunting dogs, and there he died. So it came to pass that Savannah had an accidental mayor, Mayor Wallace J. Pierpont, who was a straight-out, dyed-in-the-wool prohibitionist with a 4-year term to serve. Now, on May 1st, when Georgia went bone dry, as they called it, Savannah reportedly was very calm. My guess is because everyone was sleeping in. The night before apparently had been a great deal of revelry. People had been drinking what they could, stocking up. For those last-minute shoppers, what they could not immediately consume, they were taking home in suitcases. Mayor Pierpont immediately started demonstrating that he was determined to make Savannah dry. Within a week, the police force had raided 100 grog shops, arrested proprietors, confiscated wagon loads of booze. And over the subsequent months, the newspaper was filled with column after column of successful raids on blind tigers. The mayor also began cleaning house. He fired 2 city employees, including the fire inspector, for selling whiskey. Now, the problem with Wallace J. Pierpont was he was a dyed-in-the-wool prohibitionist who drank. He liked to go to the local beer garden on Sundays and have a beer or 2. So not only was he a prohibitionist, but he got tagged as being a hypocrite. The situation in Savannah was becoming so dire that the Hibernian Society of Savannah abandoned the customary banquet usually given on St. Patrick's Day. They decided that a dry banquet was just not worthwhile. As one despondent Hibernian complained, it would be a poor replica of past days. The gloomy mood reached the northern newspapers, with one commenting that Prohibition in Savannah has been about as popular as yellow fever in New Orleans. The police chief, very optimistic that year in his report, said, "We venture to say that the saloon has gone from Savannah and Georgia forever." The succeeding year's reports were not so positive. He complained of determined opposition, persistent violations of people of all classes. The police could not count on their convictions. Part of the problem was the police were using a spy system, basically some form of entrapment. The city court recorder, who was elected, decided that he was not going to enforce or prosecute any of these people who were captured under the spy system. He kept dismissing their cases. So the police would bring these cases, having caught these guys, and the recorder would dismiss them. So much for Savannah drying up. So by the time the government enacted the 18th Amendment, the nation went on its 13-year drought. Savannah Wets had managed to dispatch the dry Mr. Pierpont and replace him with one of their own, Mayor Murray Stewart, seen over there on the left. From the beginning, the antis claimed that his aldermanic ticket was filled with, quote, ring politicians, but even worse, they were wets. Mayor Stewart, who was indeed a confirmed wet, appeared to enjoy making sport out of infuriating state and federal officials. For the first 2 years of the decade, enforcement agents and their superiors seemed to exert more energy in public quarrels with the mayor than in executing the law. This may have been his intent. Prohibition agent Jesse M. Mercer targeted Savannah as a major problem. He proclaimed that whiskey was being openly sold in saloons in Savannah and that policemen were winking at such sales. And they most certainly were. After Mercer's report, Stewart demanded, quote, old man Mercer come to Savannah, provide specific names, and make these charges in person to the city's police force. He then taunted the agent, asserting that Mercer would never show his face in Savannah. Mercer took up the challenge and arrived in Savannah unannounced. Now the mayor, not knowing that Mercer was arriving, had more important duties to attend to. He was out on the river on a hunting trip. So Mercer wasted an entire day going from office to office to office in the city, trying to find the mayor. No one bothered to inform him where the mayor actually was. This probably did not improve his already ornery mood. The next day, when the two actually met, along with hand-picked men from the city's police force, it was rather heated. Now, this was a private meeting behind closed doors in the mayor's office. But the Mercer could be heard shouting through the door. He emerged from the meeting clearly angry. He was angry because he wanted the meeting to be public, and, well, Stewart managed to get around him. He called Stewart's high-handed tactics small, if not cowardly. Mercer was quite willing, eager even, it seemed, to talk to reporters. In one such interview, he charged that Savannah and Chatham County police were both in the ploy of the bootlegging fraternity. The situation, as Mercer saw it, was not only an embarrassment to the city, but very volatile. And I can almost hear him saying this. He candidly stated, so thoroughly organized is the liquor ring in Savannah that I honestly believed they would not stop at murder. The condition in Savannah is dangerous. Understand? Dangerous. These stories, not to mention the sensational headlines like Mercer calls Mayor Stewart cowardly, got the attention of Mercer's superior, James Fort. Fort weighed in on the controversy. Stewart, undaunted, called Major Fort an unmitigated liar in the newspaper, charged federal agents with being on the take. Now, if you know anything about Prohibition, you know that Stewart was not far off the mark. Individuals, often men of influence and prominence, always knew where the raids were when the raids were coming. Another federal Prohibition agent said that of 12 men that he could pick, the wets were always going to get to at least one of them. Whiskey agents kept better tabs on the government agents than vice versa. They had the telegraph lines between Savannah and Atlanta tapped, so they actually did know when the raids were coming. The high-profile war of words probably focused unwanted attention on Savannah, but the bootleggers seemed to have no problem getting around that. Ships coming from Britain, usually sailing from the Caribbean first, would arrive once or twice a week out there. They would drop off about 200 to 2,500 cases of liquor, unloaded them on the islands, brought them in by the rivers and creeks. You've got launches, you've got automobiles, you've got rail cars. They were even using planes. Some runners transported liquor in Cadillacs. Others used oil trucks. Apparently this was popular for the runs between Savannah and Florida. They were, and I don't have one of the Savannah oil trucks, but that's a picture of a 1920s oil truck. They were painted brightly as oil trucks, and they would be nicely padded inside for the liquor. Did I mention that Mayor Stewart was a director in an oil company in Savannah? Yeah. One recent Boston transplant had established himself as a gentleman farmer in Savannah. He shipped liquor via the railroad to Chicago. The crates were labeled and billed as sweet potatoes before he was eventually caught. As soon as agents would figure out one scheme, the bootleggers would develop another. There were some chases out in the Atlantic. In 1923, the U.S. boat Tybee, carrying local and federal prohibition agents, chased a fast liquor boat, that's what they call them, fast liquor boats, all the way to Fernandina. The Tybee opened fire, but the liquor boats were just too fast. One story printed years later, it was printed in 1938, described an incident of bootleggers stealing their own car back from federal agents when the agents left it unguarded at the post office. That was quite the embarrassment. Another reason, go back to Savannah hospitality there. Another reason for the continued success of bootleggers in Savannah was apparently their reputation for honesty. William G. Shepard, who was writing for Cosmopolitan, noted that anyone purchasing from Savannah dealers could be confident of getting the real thing, as opposed to the poisonous thing that would blind or kill you. Savannah had what was called no compromisers among them. One whiskey runner noted the great business between Savannah and Atlanta. When purchasers arrived in Savannah, the whiskey wholesalers would find you. They would take care of everything, including loading your car before you left. One might break the law, but there was no countering Southern hospitality. By the end of the era of national prohibition, the attention on Savannah was not so much the level of consumption within the city, but it was the use of the city as a major distributing hub. By the mid-1920s, Savannah had become the bottleneck of Georgia. It had extended its scope to Philadelphia, St. Louis, Boston, and New York. Savannians, having had over a decade of practice at disobeying a law to which they did not consent, now managed to export the fruits of their hard-earned experience. As the Christian Science Monitor noted, Savannah was a law unto herself, and she was dripping wet. Thank you.